Thank you very much for inviting me. I will try and talk slowly in English, but I get excited and then I go faster. So if I'm going too fast and you're losing me, can we have a little sign, maybe scratch your head? And if there's an outbreak of scratching, I'll know that I have to slow down. Better that I say less that you can understand than I say everything that I've got in my notes and nobody understood any of it. So, what I want to, you've got a little bit of a CV of me there. I'm supposed to tell you something about myself. I think that perhaps I was invited because of some of my involvement with the British Psychological Society, and we recently, I say recently, it was 3 years ago now, made a standard for the design and delivery of assessment centres, and this organisation has worked to translate that into Spanish, so it is accessible to you as well, I hope. I don't know if people are aware of that. It's a very nice document. It goes on for pages and pages of standards because that's one of my interests. But actually it's a very useful document because if you want to kind of review your process, it's a very good way of going through and saying, oh, do we do that? Do we do that? And lots of people have said to me that they found it useful like that. I do lots of other things as well. I'm very happy to talk about those, but you probably don't want to hear those. So let's think about assessment. My job is assessment. I think about assessment all the time. And I'm sure assessment comes into what you do. That may be in a formal manner, but it's also informally. We're doing assessment all the time. When you're talking to somebody, you're thinking, can this person do this? What is the problem here? Are they anxious? Should I be calming them down, or should I be zipping them up a little bit? Those are all assessments that we are making. I just do it a little bit more formally. Working with tests and questionnaires and lots of different things. So we use assessment a lot at an individual level to think about individual people, what's happening with them, what their potential is for the organisation. But we also think about groups, so how do we put teams together? What do we do when there's conflict? What's going on there? Why is that happening? Or at the organisational level, you might want to know at organisational culture. You might have an issue of turnover and want to understand what's happening at an organisational level. So what I want to talk about today is some ideas about making assessment work better for the organisation. I used to have a presentation called 7 Rules, but I've got it down to 3 because I've only got 20 minutes. So let's see where we get to. You can have all 7 later if you ask me. But the first one is, and this is really the most important one, is know what it is that you want to measure. And obviously, that is really obvious, isn't it? But I meet so many people who don't really think about what they want to measure. They've heard that another organisation is using some kind of an assessment, a computer-based thing, a situational judgment, whatever, and they think, I'll have one of those. We'd like a situational judgment test. And I said, well, what do you want to measure with your situational judgment test? Why do you want to use a personality questionnaire? So I'll tell you a story of a client of mine. This slide has got a picture in Russian, but it wasn't a Russian client, it was a UK client. But they did run a supermarket. And they ran quite a big chain of supermarkets, actually, not just one. And they said, we'd like our supermarkets to be friendlier places. So what we'd like you to do is to put in a new selection process for the people that stack the shelves, that put the goods on the shelves, because they're around the supermarket all the time. You're always seeing them and tripping over their trolleys, right, when you go to the supermarket. So if those people are friendlier, we'll make the supermarket friendlier. And so could you do that? So I was working for a company then, and we made a selection process for them, and we put it into practice, and we selected some people, and we got some new ones. And then we did a study to see if that was working. And we asked the we asked the managers of the local supermarket branches how they found the people that we'd selected. And the answer was rubbish. They said, we don't like them. They said the ones that we thought were the best, they thought were the worst. And the ones that we thought were marginal, they thought were okay. And head office said, what is this? You've charged us a lot of money to make this system, and these people are awful. And so we went back and had a look, and we talked to the managers. And what the managers said was, these people are too busy chatting to each other and to the customers, and they're not putting things on shelves. And I can't sell things if they're not on the shelves. So we went back to head office and said, you said you wanted them to be friendly and chatty. We did friendly and chatty, and now turns out that that doesn't put goods on shelves. You have to understand that there's an implication to that. People that are going to help customers find something in the shop, they won't be stacking shelves. And if they have a tendency to be friendly and talk to people, they're going to do that among each other because that's their nature. So you need to decide whether you want to spend the extra on having more people who will also be chatty or not. So you need to think about what you want, and they hadn't really thought about the implications of that, and they hadn't thought about the whole job. They'd only thought about a little bit. So one of the first rules, I think, and this is from Stephen Covey, if you know his 7 habits, begin with the end in mind. Think about where you want to be, and not just at a wouldn't it be nice if the supermarkets were a bit friendlier level, but what that's really going to look like, the whole output of it. Now, you may start by knowing that there is a problem, but you need to define that problem and you need to understand what sort of solution that you're looking for. And if you can say where we want to be at the end of it, you're much more likely to put in an assessment process which will give you the information that you need to get to that end. And that works both in terms of getting the right information and sufficiently detailed information, but also not getting too much information. So there's no point in having a very long assessment process if you really don't need to know very much, or you don't need to know it very accurately. If a broad brush picture will be enough, then you can probably use a shorter process and a cheaper process. And I say that to my clients all the time. You really don't need this big expensive one because what you need is this. But they say, I want this big expensive one because it looks nicer and shinier. So you need to think about what you want. So if you're doing a selection process, and probably a lot of people are aware of this, you need to identify the attributes that you want. So my supermarket knew that they wanted some friendly people, but they hadn't thought about the whole job. So you get a sort of a list of attributes, but quite often those attributes aren't fully thought through. So this list that I've got up here, something like good with people, well, that could be a lot of things. So here's a list of things that I think perhaps they mean in terms of good with people. But the trouble is those things don't necessarily all sit together. So somebody who inspires respect might not work cooperatively with others. Somebody who can cope with conflict may not be as easy to talk to because in a day-to-day way. So you need to really think about what you mean. And in order to do that, for a selection process, you need to start with the job. Think about the whole job that people are doing, so don't miss out a whole bit like stacking shelves. Do some kind of formal exercise. But what else I would say is get different perspectives. And this would be true of any problem. So typically a manager comes and says, this is the problem. Really interesting to see what the employees think is the problem, because they may have a different perspective on it. There are always two sides to every story, and often there are multiple. And there's certain things that people don't see. If you do 360 assessments, I don't know if people do those, so you often find that peers and colleagues see a very different aspect of an individual's work to a manager. As a manager, you see when people get it wrong, you see the problems that they have, you see what they can't do because they come to you and ask, but what you don't see is perhaps what they're doing 80% of the time when they're just dealing with stuff on their own at the desk or wherever it is. That stuff that goes well is much less visible to you because nobody complains to you about it and they don't ask you about it. So you need to think of people from different perspectives. I would also say from a diversity, equal opportunities point of view, men and women and different things like that. I have a lovely story about a job analysis of a managerial job. And they asked, this was done as a research project, but they did a job analysis, and they asked a group of men and of women to describe the job. And when they used only the data generated by the men said, this job, you needed to be quite assertive, you needed to be able to make decisions quite quickly, and there wasn't really a lot of time for consultation. And when you looked at the women's data, it said you needed to take a collaborative approach, you needed to consult with people, and you needed to think about all aspects of a problem before you made a decision. And it was the same job. So what they were describing was different ways of doing the job, not the job. So important to have a diverse thing. And it's important that when you actually, if you want to assess, that you get down to some behavioral definitions, things that you can actually measure. So this is one which you can then say is rubbish, but this is one, this is a good with people one that came out of doing some work with some clinical psychologists. So their good with people was very different from what you might expect from, say, a manager or somebody in customer service, because they were dealing with people in distress, they were having to cope with a lot of things. They were also very nice people, I have to say. One of the nicest bits of job analysis that I did was working with clinical psychologists. Okay. So, I think I'm going on to the, never mind. So think about what you want to measure, and then when you measure it, engage in evidence-based practice. Is that something that people are aware of, using the whole movement to use evidence-based practice? Seeing a few nods, good. So assessment can provide evidence for interventions. It can help you identify what the issues are in a situation. It can tell you maybe what people feel about the situation. It can also be used to look at whether between time one and putting in an intervention, things are getting better or worse. So has there been an improvement? When you use an evidence-based approach, you get the interventions that you make are likely to be more effective because they're more likely to address real issues in an appropriate way. But an evidence-based approach also helps you improve your assessment because you can see what the evidence tells you about how to do assessment better. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that because that's my area of expertise. So, there's a website at the bottom there for the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, and they have some really interesting tools there, so it's good. If you're not aware of it, then it's a good place to look. But the idea of making evidence-based practice is that you are making decisions using the best evidence available, and that you come from multiple sources. So it's not just about taking, oh, I read a survey in the paper that said, this is about evaluating evidence and saying what it is. But you need to start by asking the right question. So you need to translate a practical issue or problem into an answerable question. And this is really difficult. There's kind of two problems. You have a kind of a vague feeling that something is not right, but how do we say what the problem actually is? And different people might define it differently. And the other thing is we have a bit of a tendency to answer a question that's easier to answer. So you can kind of have a problem which is quite difficult, and we'll just address some aspect of it and say we're addressing the whole problem. So if we have a turnover problem, we can decide that that is because of, I don't know, the remuneration structure. So we'll do something about remuneration because that's one that I can talk about. That's one that I understand, rather than going in and understanding what's actually going on there and making some changes that perhaps you don't want to make. So asking the right question is critical, and then going and looking for proper evidence systematically. Again, we have a lot of biases. I'm going to be, when I talk about this, the work of Daniel Kahneman comes to mind. Is that something that people know? He's got a very interesting book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. It's really interesting to think about what we do. So one of the things in that, what he's saying is that we have a kind of an intuitive system of dealing with stuff fast, which makes quite useful decisions, but is not really evidence-based. It uses all of our biases and experience to very quickly sum up a situation, but it tends to be a bit blinkered. It doesn't see the whole picture. It looks at one thing and says, is this danger? Should I fight or should I run away? That's what it's saying. So when we have a problem, it kind of says, oh, can't do that, just let's do this. And it doesn't systematically search for evidence. It looks at what's in front of it. So it's about getting over your fast-thinking brain and engaging your slow-thinking brain is evidence-based practice. So systematically looking for evidence. So one of our biases is that we like to look for positive evidence. I say, I think Madrid is a lovely city. Look, there's a beautiful tree in bloom. Here's a lovely museum. You have some fantastic pictures. This is all lovely. So I think it's lovely. So that's what I'm looking for. Now, if somebody came and said, I think I don't like Madrid, they would look at a whole different set of evidence and they would say different things. They'd say, there's somebody begging in the street. This needs mending. Those things need to happen. So you just build the picture that you want to see. So then we need to look at whether the evidence that we have is trustworthy and how relevant it is, pull it all together and apply it to the decision-making process, which is actually, you can quite often get a lot of evidence and then make the decision you first thought of. So I've now got a whole report, and at the end, the recommendation is to do what I was going to do anyway, because that's what I wanted to do. And then you evaluate whether it works. So evidence-based practice really does improve what you do. And there's a lot of things that are not evidence-based practice in assessment. So one of the things going on at the moment is big data. You've all seen these surveys where they've got hundreds of thousands, millions of pieces of data, but just because they have it doesn't mean it's there. One of the things I do is I do a lot of analysis for people, and people come to me and they say, we've got this data set, can you analyze it for me? And the answer is, of course I can. But so the first thing I say to them is, what is the question you're asking of your data? Why did you collect this data? What did you want to know? And they look at me totally blankly, but I've got all this data. I know when people started and when they left and what that. But what did you want to know? And obviously, it is very obvious when somebody says it to you, but it's not. So that's what happens with big data. You know, we happen to have all of these things, so we can analyze it and see what percentage of these are those, but it's not necessarily data. Surveys are not necessarily data. I mean, there's hundreds, thousands of them in the HR scheme, and usually they are done by a company who wants to prove a point. So they go out, I mean, they genuinely ask a question of a sample, but they wouldn't tell you the answer unless it supported their thesis, which is that teams work better than individuals, or benefits are make people reduce turnover in staff. So you have to really wonder about it, and you see something like 27% of people thought that, I don't know, I see them all the time and they're totally idiotic, that that the sea isn't wet. And you think, well, no, that wasn't the question that was asked. The question was, you get this with dates, don't you? So 20% of people thought that, I don't know, that Britain was a kingdom 500 years ago, and they say, well, it's because they give them 4 options. They don't know the answer to the question, so they just choose arbitrarily. They're not saying that. Sorry, I'm not giving you a very good example there. So big data is not evidence. Surveys are not evidence. Fads are certainly not evidence. Just because everybody else is doing it, that doesn't mean that it's a good thing. That just means that everybody else is doing it. I've got an example here of Amazon. Amazon decided that with artificial intelligence, they get loads of CVs. A company like Amazon or Google, they get millions of CVs sent to them. They said that they would get the machines to evaluate the CVs. The machines now can understand language in a very sophisticated way. So they'll get the CVs, the machine to do the initial sift. So they gave it all the data on the resumes from thousands of people, and they gave it all of the responses of the people that had reviewed them, and the machine was supposed to look for rules for doing it. And what the machine did was essentially replicate the bias of recruiters. So one of the things the machine noticed was that the recruiters preferred male candidates. Now, whether they did that out of bias or whether they did that because the male candidates were better, it didn't matter. What the machine saw was male much more likely to be selected. So it therefore put out it found rules like, if you belong to the Women's Literature Society or the Women's IT Society, if it had women's in it, you were probably not as good a prospect. So it reduced your probability. It found some all-women's colleges, and it didn't like those either because you were much less likely to get selected from there. So basically, it was just replicating the biases in the system. If you don't have a good criterion, then AI will just replicate that. And a lot of AI systems are very dodgy from that point of view. So what is good evidence? Well, here's some evidence from using different methods of assessment, and this is based on what are called meta-analyses, where you bring together the evidence from lots and lots of different studies. And when you do that, you get a bigger picture which is not based on the vagaries of a single sample. You can also see how consistent they are. So you can see whether the studies only differ in the amount that you would think that different studies would differ a bit because all samples are a bit different, or whether they differ a lot more than that and there are other things going on. And you can see from that things like ability tests, assessment centres, personality and structured interviews are much better at selecting people who are later rated as performing well on the job than using graphology. Do people use graphology in Spain? The French still quite like graphology, so. Let me tell you what that means. So this is some simulated data from if you had a large applicant pool, you needed to choose 75% of them. Yeah, so quite a lot of them, but most of them were quite good. So it turns out that even if you have the best selection system, you only do a little bit better in getting good performers than if you have a poor one. But if you have a weak applicant pool, so only 25% of them in this case were effective, And you are much more selective, so also I modelled selecting 25%, but it could be another number. You can see that when you use good selection, you double the proportion of good performers that you get. So makes sense. The more selective you are and the harder it is to find, the more important it is to assess people effectively. There's lots more about assessment design and effectiveness. For instance, at an assessment centre, it turns out basically if you overload assessors, they don't assess very well. So if you make them measure more things, if they're looking for more things, or if they're trying to assess more people, they don't assess as well in terms of being identify the people who are later found to be the better performers on the job. They're also more biased. So that sort of comes back to the Kahneman work on System 1 and System 2. If I'm overloaded, my system shuts down and System 1 does the work, and System 1 is biased in all sorts of different ways. It uses stereotypes, and stereotypes all do have truth in them. It's just that they're not the truth for a particular individual. But System 1 uses stereotypes because it's quicker, so they make more biased decisions. So that's, whoops. And also there is tons of evidence, and who knew if you train assessors, they do a better job. It really does make a difference. If you train assessors, they give more accurate ratings, they're more reliable, and if you train them for longer, it works better. And people who have more experience do it better. It really does make a difference for assessor training. So if somebody says to you, oh, we can't do that, only have an hour, just do a quick briefing, we'll send them around a document, they'll watch a slide set. It isn't true. It's really worth investing in training your assessors. Another place where there is some really strong evidence, and this really surprised me and a lot of my colleagues, but this has been coming through over a number of years, when you're making decision-making at the end of a selection process, so typically you have lots of pieces of evidence, somebody interviewed them, maybe an exercise, maybe some tests, then typically everybody gets together. In English we call it a wash-up, and everybody says, what was this person? Were they good? Were they bad? And the idea is that the group can challenge each other and say, well, I didn't see that, and aren't you rating this person too high, and should we, is that correct? And that's called consensus decision-making. There's an alternative where instead of people coming together with their scores and impressions, they provide ratings, and then you maybe just take the average of the ratings, combine them arithmetically. It turns out that mechanical ratings are fantastically more effective than qualitative. So this is just one of a whole set of studies, but this is looking, so on the left, the validity is the correlation between job performance in the first line and the scores, and in the middle column, you can see that when you do qualitative studies, those are the validities you get, which are perfectly respectable. They're okay, they have value. But it turns out when you take the same data and you analyze it rather than having the discussion, so that's mechanical, you can see how much that goes up. That is a really big effect. And I think it's one that people ignore at their peril. First of all, if you've ever been involved in those assessment centres where you sit around at 9 o'clock at night trying to make a decision, why would you want to do that when somebody can just do some arithmetic at 6 o'clock and you can go home? Or you can be in the bar having a drink? I don't know. Cheaper, quicker, faster? Seems better to me, and more effective. So, the last one that I wanted to say was follow-up. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but one of the things that always strikes me is that I do a lot of work for people putting in assessment processes. It's expensive. We invest a lot of time and energy in doing it. We make the measures, and then they go into a filing cabinet somewhere and they never get looked at again. So maybe we make a selection decision, but we've got lots more information on those people. Why don't the managers know what we found out at selection to say, this is what the person is really good at, these are the areas where they might need a bit more support, here's where they need development. Why aren't we using it? The same with development. It's no good just identifying someone's development needs. Let's actually develop it. If we're looking at the organisation, let's use that information. So, I could go on and on and on, but I'm being asked to stop. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.